The Zelthari had observed countless species across the galaxy, from primitive creatures barely aware of their own existence to civilizations that had harnessed the power of stars. They prided themselves on their meticulous classification of intelligent life, sorting them into categories of threat, potential allies, or unfortunate mistakes that needed to be erased. When their deep space probes first catalogued Earth, it was marked as a world of moderate interest, filled with a diverse biosphere and an emerging sentient species, humans. Initial assessments labeled humans as omnivorous tool users, capable of social organization and rudimentary conflict. Nothing unusual. The Zelthari had encountered such species before, aggressive at times but ultimately predictable. They believed the humans could be guided, perhaps integrated into the galactic compact so long as their instincts were properly contained. It was only after more in-depth analysis that unease began to settle over the scientific teams. The problem wasn't simply that humans fought wars. War, after all, was common. Many species engaged in territorial disputes, resource skirmishes, or ideological battles. But humanity's wars were different. Their conflicts spanned millennia, growing in complexity and devastation with each passing era. More disturbing was the way humans fought, not for survival alone but for dominance, conquest, and sometimes, seemingly, for the sheer challenge of it. Unlike other predatory species, they did not just hunt for food or defense. They hunted for sport, for ideology, for vengeance. The High Council debated their findings at length. Perhaps humans had outgrown their violent past. Many species did. But then came the footage. Recordings of trench warfare, nuclear detonations, asymmetrical combat strategies. The calculated brutality of ancient empires. The industrial efficiency of mechanized war. The chilling discipline of elite units who could eliminate threats with precision that bordered on artistry. No, this was not a species that had moved beyond violence. This was a species that had mastered it. Still, the Council needed proof. An experiment was arranged. A small contingent of humans, carefully selected from different backgrounds, cultures, and professions, were discreetly extracted from Earth and placed in a controlled environment. The Zelthari believed that, without weapons, without military command, these humans would show their natural instincts. Perhaps they could be reasoned with, if their aggression was merely a response to environmental pressures. The experiment began as expected. The humans, confused but adaptive, explored their artificial habitat, a self-sustaining environment meant to simulate isolation. The Zelthari observed from beyond hidden barriers, monitoring heart rates, cognitive responses, social interactions. It was not the first time they had conducted such experiments. The patterns were predictable. First, confusion. Then, cooperation. Then, a gradual adjustment to their new reality. But the humans skipped the expected steps. They adapted instantly. There was no prolonged confusion, no blind panic. They identified leadership within hours, forming an organized hierarchy without prompting. They tested the limits of their environment, setting traps for unseen watchers, studying the rhythm of automated food deliveries, even faking injuries to observe medical response protocols. This was not passive observation. This was tactical intelligence gathering. More unsettling was their reaction to perceived threats. When the Zelthari introduced minor stress tests, a sudden change in temperature, a simulated predator, a resource scarcity, the humans did not simply react. They strategized. They tested weaknesses, experimented with defenses, and, more than once, turned the tests against their creators. A security drone, meant only for observation, was dismantled and repurposed within a day. The Zelthari expected confusion. They got ingenuity. Still, the Council was hesitant. A small group of humans excelling in an experiment did not confirm that their entire species was dangerous. So they escalated the test. They introduced a controlled conflict, a simulated opposing force, composed of captured creatures from another world, bred for combat but lacking true intelligence. The humans should have responded with fear, perhaps cooperation. Instead, they slaughtered their opposition within hours. The Zelthari were not naive. They had seen war before. But there was something disturbing about the efficiency. The humans did not just defeat their enemies, they studied them, improved upon their weaknesses, and adapted. They anticipated strategies that should have been unknowable. They learned at an impossible rate. And when the Zelthari, in their arrogance, attempted to modify the environment further, when they introduced harsher conditions, more deadly opponents, greater obstacles, the humans only grew stronger. The experiment was no longer an experiment. It was a mistake. Urgent discussions erupted among the Council. Some argued for immediate containment, even termination. Others insisted that the humans were simply misunderstood, that their violence was a survival mechanism rather than an inherent nature. A decision had to be made. But before the council could reach a conclusion, a far more terrifying discovery was made. In their effort to gather a representative sample of humanity, the Zeltari had made an error. They had taken individuals from various nations, seeking diversity in thought and behavior. Some were civilians. Some were trained professionals. And among them, they had unknowingly included a subset of humans who belonged to a particular category. A category that defied even the advanced predictive models of the Zeltari. These humans did not simply endure hardship. They embraced it. They did not fear violence. They perfected it. Their tactical acumen was not learned over time. It was ingrained. And now, these humans had identified their captors. It was no longer a controlled study. It was a war. The Zeltari had spent centuries perfecting their methods of species analysis, yet nothing in their vast experience had prepared them for what came next. Their research teams had spent months cataloging human behavior, watching the captives adapt, strategize, and outmaneuver every simulated challenge placed before them. They had concluded that humans were dangerous, yes, but they had yet to understand just how dangerous. Then the Americans arrived. Unlike the first batch of captives, these humans had not been selected for diversity. They had been taken in a single high-risk extraction, an elite military team on a routine deployment, snatched from their world in the dead of night. The Zeltari had assumed that, like the others, these soldiers would react with confusion, then caution, before ultimately submitting to the reality of their captivity. But these humans did not wake up in confusion. They woke up in formation. Even before regaining full consciousness, they were assessing their surroundings, processing the sterile air, the artificial lighting, the faint hum of alien machinery beyond the walls. Their instincts did not allow for hesitation. Their minds were already running tactical assessments, categorizing threats, planning contingencies. When the first of them opened his eyes, his name, according to his unit's insignia, was Staff Sergeant Mitchell. He did not ask where he was. He asked where his weapon was. The Zeltari had underestimated something fundamental about this subset of humanity. These were not ordinary soldiers. These were predators of a different breed. Men and women forged through rigorous training, tested in battle, and hardened by conflicts so brutal that even their fellow humans feared them. They had been shaped by war in ways the Zeltari could not yet comprehend. When the first alien observers entered the chamber, expecting docile subjects, the Americans did not cower. They studied their captors. They noted their movements, their armor plating, the subtle delay in their reaction times. They identified weaknesses. And then they tested them. The Zeltari did not realize their mistake until it was too late. The holding facility, designed to contain passive captives, was not built to withstand an active resistance force. Within hours, the Americans had mapped the layout of their containment zone, determined the locations of surveillance devices, and discovered the routines of their alien jailers. By the time the Zeltari security forces recognized the shift in behavior, the first guard had already gone missing. The council was alerted, alarms blaring through the station. Containment teams were dispatched to suppress what they still believed was a minor uprising. They expected to find frightened, disoriented humans struggling against superior technology. Instead, they found themselves hunted. The Americans did not fight with brute force. They fought with precision. They moved through the facility like ghosts, striking in coordinated attacks, seizing weapons, eliminating targets without hesitation. The Zeltari, for all their advancements, had never encountered an enemy like this. The battle doctrine of their empire was based on overwhelming force, on calculated engagements where the enemy was broken before they could retaliate. Their warriors had never trained for a scenario where they were outmaneuvered. And now they were losing control. Mitchell and his team moved swiftly, capitalizing on the confusion. With every Zeltari they took down, they learned more: how their weapons functioned, how their armor distributed weight, how their chain of command operated. It was textbook asymmetric warfare, executed with terrifying efficiency. The Americans had no maps, no translators, no reinforcements. And yet, they advanced as though they had spent years studying Zeltari tactics. They had not. They simply adapted faster than any species should be capable of adapting. The station's control center was their primary objective. They needed intelligence, where they were, who had taken them, and how to turn the situation to their advantage. As they moved, they left nothing behind but chaos and dead Zeltari. It was only when they breached the first security hub that they finally understood what they were dealing with. The data logs confirmed their captors' worst fears. This was not the first human experiment. The Zeltari had been studying their kind for years, possibly longer. The logs detailed experiments, failed attempts to classify humanity, the slow realization that Earth was not just another developing world. It was a problem. One of the soldiers, Corporal Vasquez, scrolled through the reports, her face unreadable. "They think we're some kind of anomaly," she muttered, scanning the logs. "Like we shouldn't exist the way we do." Mitchell barely glanced at the data. He had already pieced together the bigger picture. The Zeltari had taken humans before. They had underestimated them. And now, in a final, catastrophic blunder, they had taken the wrong ones. A sudden change in the station's systems confirmed what the Americans had suspected. The Zeltari were preparing for a counterattack. Security teams were converging, desperate to contain the crisis before it spiraled beyond their control. Heavy footsteps echoed through the corridors, the distinctive hum of plasma weapons charging. Mitchell exhaled slowly, then turned to his squad. "They're coming." No one panicked. No one hesitated. Instead, Vasquez gave a slow, predatory grin. "Good." The lights in the control room flickered. A distant explosion shook the structure. Somewhere in the darkness, an alarm began to wail. The Americans took their positions, weapons raised, bodies low, movements precise. The Zeltari had sought to study them. Now they were about to learn a lesson. The Zeltari Council convened in emergency session, their chamber dimly lit by the holographic projections flickering before them. The air carried the scent of burning circuits, a bitter reminder that the situation aboard the research station had spiraled into catastrophe. Data feeds streamed across the central display, each line more damning than the last. The humans had taken the station's security network offline. They had seized weapons, disrupted critical systems, and evaded capture at every turn. But the worst revelation was not what the Americans had done. It was how quickly they had done it. Grand Strategist Zither, a veteran of 1,000 conflicts, watched the footage in silence. He had seen planetary uprisings, last stands against impossible odds, species fighting desperately for survival. He had never seen anything like this. These humans did not fight like a species cornered. They fought like a force of nature unleashed. The others in the chamber whispered in disbelief, voices hushed with an emotion the Zeltari rarely acknowledged, fear. "We must contain this," High Chancellor Vorash declared, his voice strained. "If word spreads, if the other galactic powers learn what we've found." "They will learn," Zither interrupted, his tone grave. "Containment is no longer an option." The chamber fell silent. They all understood the implications. The research station was meant to be a controlled environment, a way to observe humanity from a safe distance. Now the humans had flipped the balance. The Americans had taken control of a Zeltari vessel and, worse, had transmitted a distress signal before vanishing into the void. Other species had already intercepted it. The first to respond was the Ithari Dominion, a warrior race that had long respected strength above all else. Their warlords studied the fragmented transmission, analyzing the combat footage, the brutal efficiency of human tactics. Within hours, an envoy sent a single message to the Zeltari Council. "We wish to meet these humans." For the Ithari, this was not a catastrophe. This was an opportunity. A chance to test themselves against a species that had, against all odds, outmaneuvered the Zeltari's best forces. Their fleets had begun moving even before diplomacy could be considered. But not all responses were filled with admiration. The Seraphim Empire, a civilization of scholars and visionaries, reacted with alarm. Unlike the Ithari, they saw past the battle tactics and into something far more disturbing. They had long suspected that humans were different, that their history of relentless war and conquest marked them as a potential galactic anomaly. Now there was proof. To them, humanity was not merely a threat. It was an extinction event waiting to happen. A message arrived from the Seraphim Council, urgent and uncompromising. "Contain them or we will." The Zeltari had been thrust into a crisis unlike any before. They had always believed themselves to be the unseen hand guiding the galaxy's development, deciding which species ascended and which vanished before they could become problems. But now they were no longer the unseen force. They were the ones scrambling for control. The humans had done what no species had ever done before. They had forced the galaxy to notice them. Somewhere in deep space, aboard the stolen Zeltari vessel, Staff Sergeant Mitchell studied the stolen star maps. His squad had worked tirelessly to decipher the alien data banks, piecing together the greater galactic picture. They now understood the scale of what they had stumbled into. They were not just survivors of an abduction. They were representatives of their species in an unfolding interstellar crisis. And they were not going home. Not yet. Mitchell turned to Vasquez, who was reviewing intercepted transmissions from the Zeltari capital. Her expression was unreadable. They're panicking, she murmured. Whole factions arguing over what to do with us. Mitchell exhaled slowly. Good. Let's keep it that way. The galaxy had taken notice. Now the Americans would decide what came next. The message spread across the galaxy like wildfire, a ripple that disrupted the delicate balance of power among the stars. Humanity had been a quiet, unnoticed force, a species assumed to be just another primitive civilization inching toward the inevitable first contact. Now they had arrived not as humble diplomats or desperate refugees, but as something far more dangerous, a force to be reckoned with. For the Zelthri, the situation had spiraled beyond their control. The failed containment of the Americans had turned into a spectacle, one that could not be buried beneath bureaucratic silence or diplomatic maneuvering. The Ithari Dominion had already deployed scouting vessels toward Earth, eager to assess this new species for themselves. The Seraphim Empire had begun rallying their allies, pushing for immediate action before humanity could establish itself as an undeniable threat. The Zelthri had no choice but to act. A delegation was formed, their mission clear: reach Earth before anyone else did. If humanity was to be confronted, it would be on terms dictated by the Zelthri, not the war-hungry Ithari or the fearful Seraphim. The Council could not allow humanity to dictate the next move. But they were already too late. The Americans had returned home first. Mitchell stood in the heart of a classified military installation, surrounded by high-ranking officials whose faces betrayed only fragments of the storm raging behind their eyes. His squad had been debriefed for hours, their accounts dissected, their stolen data analyzed. Every recorded moment of the Zelthri experiment had been scrutinized and understood. The world's leaders were no longer debating the existence of extraterrestrial life. They were debating their response. Across the room, a four-star general studied the intercepted galactic transmissions, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the steel table. Finally he exhaled. The Zelthri see us as a mistake, he murmured. The Seraphim see us as a threat. The Ithari see us as a challenge. His gaze lifted to Mitchell. What do you see? Mitchell didn't hesitate. An opportunity. The room fell silent. He leaned forward, his expression unyielding. They weren't ready for us. That's why they lost control. They thought we were just another species to be categorized, but they didn't understand what we are. Now they do. He let that sink in before adding, and the ones who fear us? They're right too. A tense pause followed. Then the general smiled. Then let's make sure they stay afraid. The decision was made. Humanity would not wait for the galaxy to decide its fate. Earth would not be a silent, distant world, waiting for the inevitable invasion or containment. The Zelthri had tried to study them in secret, but now humanity was stepping into the galactic arena on its own terms. As Mitchell and his squad left the room, Vasquez chuckled under her breath. Think they're ready for us? Mitchell glanced at her, then at the night sky beyond the base's walls. They weren't ready the first time, he said. They won't be ready the next.